challenges. Be sure to keep an eye out for our weekly Insomnia and Connection emails that list upcoming events and opportunities to stay connected. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the college's website for those who cannot make it live today. Please use the Q&A function on your screen to submit any questions. Now, I'm very excited to introduce to you young alum Bobby O'Donnell, class of 2016. Author of Running Wild, Bobby O'Donnell was born and raised in New England and is a 2016 graduate of St. Anselm College. After the trauma of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, he set out on a quest to run a marathon on all 7 continents. These experiences in all corners of the globe helped him restore his love of running and work through PTSD, discovering firsthand the important positive correlation that exercise and nature has on mental health. Bobby advocates through his book and speaking to large and small audiences about his journey. Between working as a critical care paramedic, O'Donnell continues to run, race, and hike all over the world, including a through hike of the Appalachian Trail in the summer of 2016. Please help me in welcoming Bobby O'Donnell, class of 2016.
Awesome, Kylie. Thank you so much for setting this up. Really excited to do this. This is my first webinar talk, so hopefully we'll get through this all right. I'm not, even though graduating in 2016, I'm not as tech savvy as I probably should be for being in my mid-20s. I'm gonna just, give me a second, I'm gonna put up a slideshow, give you some nice photos to look at while I speak so you don't have to look at my face for the next 40 minutes or so. Great, is that up okay, Kylie? It is, all right, wonderful. So the slideshow that you're gonna be seeing for the next 40 minutes is a collection of photographs that were taken over my travels over the past few years that occurred across the continents and through the Appalachian Trail as well. These photos will be, they're generated randomly. It's a form of entertainment for you as you're listening to me speak, so I don't bore you too much. Sometimes there might be, I was giving a talk in London 2 months ago, and I was talking about something very serious, and a funny photo of a penguin came up, so hopefully it'll coincide okay with what I'm speaking with. So I hope that everyone first off is staying safe and healthy during quarantine, that you're finding things to keep you occupied, and that you're checking in on others. A lot of what my talk today is going to be about, it'll hopefully be entertaining for you. I know entertaining is quite a subjective word, but hopefully you'll be able to take something away from it. And most importantly, what I would like people to be thinking about is their mental health through all of this. I think that this COVID crisis is something that's completely going to change the entire world and how we look at it moving forward, even once we move out of the stay-at-home orders. And it's going to be something that's impacting your mental health, whether you're realizing it right now or not. When we look at mental health, it's something that's a very hot topic. It's a kind of a trigger word in the news these days. But I think that we still have a long way to opening the dialogue because people are embarrassed or ashamed to talk about it. And my hope with publishing the book, Running Wild, was to share my story and for people to be more comfortable sharing their own. My story starts with the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. It was undoubtedly the worst day of my life, but I needed that day to happen for all of these incredible things to happen afterwards. When I've been giving these talks recently since the book came out, the Boston Marathon is obviously, it's the juicy bit of the story. It's what everyone wants to hear about. So I inevitably end up talking about it. And I think that's important in therapy itself. When you struggle with something, talking through it, writing it down, there's so many different forms to go through and to work through it. And for me, giving these speeches is actually, even 7 years later, still a form of therapy. So the Boston Marathon bombing, April 15th, 2013, I was at the end of my freshman year at St. A's, and I had been training for the Boston Marathon that entire year. I ran cross country under Coach Paul Finn that year. But my story about getting to the Boston Marathon is actually incredibly superficial. I was not a runner growing up. I was not a runner in high school, even until the tail end of it. I actually only started running because I wanted a Boston Marathon jacket. It is really that simple. There's nothing more complicated about it. My dad's birthday, it was a couple weeks ago now. It's always right around the Boston Marathon, which is the third Monday in April every year. So we would go into Boston, we would go into the North End, get a pizza, go to different restaurants, walk around and enjoy the start of spring in Boston. And in 2011, we were walking around and it was the day after the Boston Marathon. And we were looking around and there were these people wearing these nice looking Adidas windbreakers that had 26.2 on the collar, and being 17 years old at the time, it was just a cool looking jacket and I wanted one. And as soon as we got close enough to see what those jackets actually were, and we realized that they were from the Boston Marathon, my dad had said to me, he said, "Oh, what are you going to go run the Boston Marathon?" And at 17, I said, "Yeah, you know, I think I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna set out and I'm gonna complete this goal." So the first thing I had to do was figure out if I actually enjoyed running. And I remember very early on how much I hated it. And I think that's probably going to be the most relatable thing that people will be able to connect with in my story, is the idea of hating running at times. But running is, and throughout my running career, is definitely a love-hate relationship. But I inevitably kept going out of stubbornness or sheer willpower, that I wanted to prove a point, that I could set a goal and do something. And also I still really wanted the jacket. So as we moved forward and moved into St. A's, I realized the difficulty in getting a place in the Boston Marathon. You have to be very, very fast, or you can raise money for a charity. Those are the only two ways to get into this race. It's one of the most difficult races in the world to get into. I was lucky enough to have an uncle who worked for John Hancock, who's one of the principal sponsors of the Boston Marathon. And he was able to secure a number for me, and I could choose which charity I wanted to raise money for. I was a brand new emergency medical technician at the time, and even early on in that career, I realized how difficult pediatric emergencies were. And I wasn't sure I could ever work with peds every single day, especially ones with terminal illness and who suffered incredible trauma. And I gave so much credit to the people that were doing that. And we're fortunate enough to be in New England, where one of the best children's hospitals in the world is Boston Children's Hospital. So it was really no question that I would raise money for them. So throughout my first year at St. A's and figuring out college life and the bad smells of Dominic Hall and everything else, it was filled with running, studying, and fundraising. It was a very busy year to be 18, 19 years old for me. And with the help of my family and my friends, I raised upwards of $7,000 for children's that year. And that was the stressful part. It was getting all of the fundraising done and the logistics. So when April 15th, 2013 rolled around, it was about celebrating that day. I didn't have to stress anymore. The training was done. The fundraising was done. I was finally going to run the Boston Marathon. And what had happened is that running transformed for me over that year. It wasn't just about a jacket anymore. It was about actually loving the sport of running. And it was about being part of something that was much larger than myself. It was about all of these children that I had met and that I had raised money for, and all these people who had supported me and believed in me. And this day was going to be a celebration of that. And there's very few days throughout your life, I think, that you can wake up in the morning and know that for certain it will be a day that you'll never forget. I knew that the Boston Marathon, my first one, was I would always remember all the details about that day. And unfortunately, it ended up becoming a day that America will never forget. I was about a half mile from the finish line of the marathon when the bombs went off. The Boston Marathon is very famous for two quick turns right at the end of it. The saying is you take a right on Hereford, left on Boylston Street. And because of that, although you're a half mile by the race course, as the crow flies, you're a lot closer. So when the bombs went off, I could hear the explosions, but you couldn't see anything. You were blocked by buildings. But at 19 years old, I would have, or really anyone of any age, why would you expect that those are bombs? You're in a city during a large event. There's going to be loud noises. There's stuff going on, but would never have expected there to be a bombing. The first indication was that police officers stopped the race where I were. People had trickled their way through to get to the finish line. I was stopped. And you start waiting and you're wondering. And at first, people are confused. And they're wondering why, after you're running for a few hours and you're so close to completing this goal, why you'd be stopped. The Boston Marathon never stops. Why today is it stopping? And then people start to get angry after a few minutes go by that the police weren't quite sure what had happened. So there was no information being conveyed to us of what had occurred. And you're doing kind of the stereotypical thing that runners do. You're stretching in place, you're moving around. And finally, the police stated that the race was over and that we needed to move away from the direction of Boylston Street, but still weren't quite sure what had happened. And the first inkling that something was actually terribly wrong was people were starting to run back towards us from Boylston Street. These spectators that were trying to flee from the bombs were running back towards us. And it was like something that you'd see out of a movie scene when people are running away from something down a city street. And I finally stopped someone, and I stopped this woman, and I'll never forget the look that she had when she looked up at me. And I said, you know, what happened? What's going on? And she said that bombs had exploded at the finish line. And she told me specifically that they blew up the grandstands. Now, because my uncle was working for John Hancock and had got me this number, he also very generously gave us these VIP passes for my parents, my grandparents, my aunt, my cousin, for them to sit in the grandstands so they didn't have to stand on Boylston Street and wait for me to finish. So essentially every person in my life that I loved and cared about was sitting in those grandstands, and in a fraction of a second in my head, they were taken from me. And when you think about bombings, it made sense. All the movies that you see, they're not randomly in a street, they're in a specific targeted area. So it makes sense. I could picture it very vividly in my mind, someone putting a bomb underneath the grandstands because of what you see in the media and movies and TV shows over time. And it made complete sense to me. And in those few minutes, my entire life changed. I walked purposelessly down the street, completely empty and not quite sure what to do. Everyone that I cared about was gone. And there was a bit of me that held out hope. And as the sirens were blaring in the street and news crews were starting to make their way closer to the finish line, I don't run with a cell phone. So I stopped one of these news crews and I asked if I could borrow a cell phone. And I called my mom. And it didn't even ring. It went straight to an automated message that said, the person that you're trying to reach cannot be dialed. And called my dad, it was the same thing. My grandmother, the same thing. And in my head, it wasn't that, oh, of course they would shut down cell service because they're worried about cellular devices detonating more bombs. It was that their phones had exploded and I can't reach them now. And a funny thing happens with your brain, I think, when you go through trauma, is that it does try to protect itself. And in the process of writing the book and working with my publisher, one of the biggest things they wanted more details about the Boston Marathon bomb. They wanted more about what I was feeling that day and more about everything that I could think about. And I tried really hard, and it was actually a bit traumatic to really work through that day in depth, because when I give these speeches, a lot of it is you're saying the same thing so many times, and I'm able to rehearse it and say it. But when I really thought about it and really forced myself into it, what I found out is that there were gaps in my memory from that day. And as hard as I tried to think about and remember every minute of that moment, I couldn't. There were these large spaces in between it. And a lot of that, I think, is my brain trying to protect itself. But what did happen, and what I try to advocate and talk about all the time, is that in the midst of this tragedy, it brought out the best of Boston that day. People who run the Boston Marathon are from all over the world. They're not even from, Massachusetts, lots of out of state and lots of people from out of the country. And their cell phones, their hotel room keys, everything that they need is at this finish line that they now can't get to. So imagine being completely lost in a city in the midst of a terrorist attack, and you have absolutely no idea where you are or where you should even go. And people were coming out of apartments, and they had water, they had jackets, they were inviting people into their homes, and they were just providing anything for these runners. And it was a really special thing. And I was the benefactor of one of those, where I sat on a woman's steps and just trying to comprehend where my life was supposed to go from here without my parents and without my family. And just, it was too big for me to even think about. And I'm not sure what made me do it, but I borrowed a cell phone from the woman, and I texted my mom, and I just said, "Mom, it's Bobby. I'm okay. I love you." And she replied to me right away, because text messages were still going through. And we established this plan to meet at Fenway Park, far enough away from Boylston Street that we could meet. And we were reunited, and I can't describe the roller coaster of emotions over those few hours, from thinking that everyone in my life was gone to having them back. And I hope that I never have a swing of emotions that even comes close to that ever again. In the days, in the weeks, and the months following the Boston Marathon, I remember going back to St. A's probably the Wednesday or Thursday of that week, and walking back in and seeing my roommate and my hallmates and Dominic Hall. And everyone obviously said how sorry they were. But there was this Boston strong attitude that was going on. It was everywhere. There were signs everywhere. There were posters. It was everything on social media and the news. So when people would ask if I would go back and run the race the following year, the immediate answer was yes, of course. There was no way that I wasn't going to go back and run Boston. It was almost like this calling that you had to go back and take back the city in a way. But the feelings that I were having in that first month and in the summer after, the most prominent one was guilt. My family was at the finish line. They saw the bombs. They were in the midst of all of it. And they were obviously very disturbed by it, and it impacted them greatly. And if I wasn't running the Boston Marathon, they would never have been there. It was my fault that they were at that finish line and they were in danger, and there was nothing that I could do about it. So I focused so much on making sure that my mom was okay, that my girlfriend at the time was okay. And it became very taxing because I didn't focus on my own mental health. And this is something that I feel in the recent weeks that I've been able to relate to COVID and different interviews that I've done, because the big concern that I had when I started to feel the anxiety following the Boston Marathon bombing and the depression that ensued was that I didn't have the right to feel that way, because all things considered, my family was okay. I had all my limbs. We got out okay. Other people lost their loved ones. They lost their limbs. People had suffered so much more than me. What right did I have to feel this way? What right did I have to get PTSD or depression? I didn't go through enough to have that happen to me. So I hid it and I didn't tell anyone because I was ashamed and I was embarrassed to have these feelings, because I thought it would be viewed as weakness, because I thought that people had gone through much worse and that I shouldn't be feeling this way. When we look at this COVID crisis, you know, as a country, we're incredibly competitive and we're very comparative. So when we look at these frontline healthcare workers in New York who are seeing the worst of the worst, it's easy for us to say, and I say it all the time, oh, I don't have it so bad because these people are really suffering from what they're going through. And I've not lost a loved one from COVID, so I shouldn't be stressed about it. But your entire life has been completely upended and disrupted in every single imaginable way. And you can't compare what you're going through to a paramedic or a nurse or a doctor in New York, because what you're going through is your own situation and you deserve to feel every emotion that comes with that. And it's important to communicate that with your loved ones, with your friends, because the way we get through things is talking about it. And I want everyone to feel like they have the license to do that, and they have the ability to feel depressed that this sucks. It sucks to be in quarantine. People have it worse, but it's still not fun to not be able to go out with your friends or to be able to travel, or if your vacation got canceled. Just because you think that all these people are having it so much worse than you, your situation is still disrupted, and it's okay to be depressed or anxious about the future. And I think that opening this dialogue through all of it is really important. So if you take anything away from my talk today, I would rather you check in on a loved one or someone working in healthcare or someone that you feel is really impacted. Send someone a text, call someone. I'd rather you do that than buy my book. I would much rather you check in on someone, and including yourself following this. So I'd like to tell the next part of this talk as kind of the moment where things started to get a little bit better for me. When I finally started to focus on my own mental health, and I realized how disturbed actually was and how much worse it was because I hadn't dealt with it upfront and immediately. It had progressed to a level that I wasn't able to control myself. And one of the first things that I did was, when I finally admitted to myself that I needed to seek help, is that I went to health services at St. A's, because it was the week leading up to the Boston Marathon in 2014, where I really wasn't sure I wanted to go back into the city and run that year. It was incredibly stressful because so many people around me were so supportive, and I was going to go back and I was going to run the marathon and it was going to be this great thing. And I put so much hope into that physical act of crossing the finish line in 2014 was going to give me closure. And I put all my eggs in one basket. And when I finally crossed that finish line, it felt good, but then I had a nightmare a few days later, and I realized the dangerousness of expectations at that point. And I realized that I needed to see someone. So I went to health services and I saw a counselor and we talked through it. And I did this a couple more times, but it's a very difficult thing when you admit that you have mental illness, because there's no x-ray or CAT scan that can show you that you have something wrong. You're the one who initially makes that diagnosis, and then you have to take it upon yourself to seek out that help. And once you say it out loud, it's outside of your head and it becomes even more real. And that in itself is very difficult. And then when you say it to someone else, it's even harder. So when you seek counseling and it doesn't work, that's almost even more depressing in itself. And I don't want this to be misconstrued that counseling doesn't work, because in lots of ways it does. And for thousands and thousands of people, it is an incredible form of therapy and it helps them get through things. But for me, it just wasn't working, and it wasn't what I needed to do. And I realized at that moment that I needed to change my life entirely, because I was falling down a very slippery slope. I grew up in suburban Massachusetts. I had wonderful parents. I had no financial difficulties. I was doing well at St. A's. I was in a very good position aside from everything that was going on inside my brain. So I never had any reason to change or do anything radical or do anything different, because I was very content with the path that I was on. So when I decided to do something different, I said, I need to do something that the old me would never have done, because so much about what I thought my healing was going to be was that I needed to get back to the old Bobby O'Donnell. And I started to realize every day that I was never going to get back to that. As much as I wanted it and I wanted to return to the normalcy and simplicity of my life, I was never going to be able to get there, and I was changed. But now I had an opportunity to choose where I wanted to go and be this new person. So I was working as a paramedic at Spear Hospital in Plymouth, New Hampshire, and I was working their emergency room. And there was an advertisement for a medical mission trip to Nicaragua. And I thought to myself that the old me would have never done that. I would have never had the need to, but maybe it's time. This is going to be it. This is going to be the thing that I do. That it was almost like a desperate grasp to try to change. So my father, who's an emergency room nurse as well, the two of us went on this trip, and that trip changed my life in a lot of different ways. It was my first time leaving the country. I was 20 years old. It was January 2015 so it was my winter break from St. A's during my junior year. And when we were in Nicaragua, we were in a very remote part of the country, and we got to do lots of great things medically, but almost selfishly, sometimes I think about what I took personally away from this. And it was that I finally felt comfortable running again. And it came in the form of being on this beach and realizing that I was in a part of the world that I'd never heard about until 2 or 3 months ago, and that there had to be so many places around the world that were this beautiful and this remote, that if I was so closed-minded about traveling and seeing the world, that I really needed to start opening myself up. And like I had mentioned, I'd argue I didn't face any adversity until the Boston Marathon bombing. And all of a sudden at 19 years old, my first worldly experience is this terrorist attack. So now the world is this large, scary, terrifying place. And I needed to figure out a way to open myself back up to it. And it was almost as if it was just curing fear by exposure. So we were sitting on this beach, and I realized that I would just be able to see more of it if I went for a run. And running had been almost traumatic in a way for me for the past year and a half, because it was a trigger. It was anytime I was lacing my running shoes up or I could hear the beep of my watch, it reminded me of the bombing. And what had been a stress relief that I would do between classes and on the weekends and after work, what had been so beneficial for me for so many years was now inducing stress. It was doing the exact opposite of what I wanted it to do. So I became afraid over the months to even go for a run. But I thought, I can see so much more of this place if I was just running. So I put my shoes on and I started running on this beach and then into the jungle. And for the first time, I was running for myself. I wasn't running because I wanted a jacket. I didn't want to beat a time. I wasn't running for a team. I wasn't running for anything except for the pure reason that I loved to run. And I loved the way that it made my body feel in this very primal sense of getting my heart rate up and sweating and feeling the burn in my lungs. And it was like a switch had flipped that I suddenly realized what I needed to do. When I got back from Nicaragua, I thought about where I wanted to go next. And I said, there are so many places in the world that I can go. How am I ever going to figure out where the best places to run are? And just being goal oriented and still having another year left at St. A's, I said, I'll be able to do one trip this summer and then who knows where from there. But being goal oriented, it was that I was going to run a marathon on all 7 continents. So I'll tell one story here. I'm not going to tell all of them because I do still hope that you buy the book. And if I had told you everything, then you'd have no reason to buy it. But the most important story, I think, out of all the continents was actually my last one, because it was a very humbling experience for me. I was on my 7th continent, which was Asia, and I decided to run the Mount Everest Marathon. It's the highest altitude marathon in the world. You start just below Everest Base Camp at about 17,000 feet. And to do this race, you are going out with a group of people because you have to be on the same acclimatization schedule. Being at altitude is difficult. Running at altitude is even harder. So you spend a few weeks with the other runners. You're trekking around the Himalayas, seeing some real, oh, there's a picture right there of a yak in the Himalaya. Good timing. But we spend lots of time together, and I met some of my closest friends on this trip. And I think something very interesting happens when you're traveling, that you're able to relate to people in a way that you're in a very remote, strange part of the world, and everyone has a reason for being there. And people's souls are open to conversations that are more difficult to have with sometimes people that you've known your entire life. And you feel this freedom of speech and openness with these people. So 2 of my best friends I met on this trip, Tom Power, who's a police detective in Ireland, and Fiona Smith, who's a reindeer herder in Scotland. And we've stayed in touch. This was December 2017. And since then, I live in Scotland now. And with Fiona and a lot of the other reindeer herders. And Tom's been to Scotland to visit us. They've come to America multiple times, and they've completely changed my life. So to do the marathon, you spend lots of time trekking and doing practice runs of shorter distances to get your lungs ready, to prepare yourself of what it's like to run at this altitude. And I had this idea of what finishing the 7 continents was going to be like. I knew exactly what the Instagram post was going to say. I knew exactly what I was going to look like crossing the finish line. And I had a lot of time to think about it. I had signed up for Everest maybe a year ahead of time. And I had all of these things figured out in my head about how perfect it was going to be. And what actually happened was the complete opposite of what I could have expected. So I had been going on and on about how wonderful it is to spend so much time with all these runners and all these incredible people for an extended period of time. The bad thing about that, especially in a 3rd world country, is that transmission of bugs and pathogens is a lot easier in this setting. When you're camping together every night, you're eating together. And there was a GI bug that was going around the camp about a week before the race. And in that time, I like to say that I was doing it before it was cool. I started to self-quarantine myself because I didn't want to catch this GI bug and then not be able to race, because runners were already dropping out of the race because their illness was so severe that there was no way they were going to be able to compete in such an extreme environment. So I did the best I could. I stayed healthy. In the morning of the race, I still felt fine, and I set off. And it wasn't until about 13 miles into the race that I started to realize that something was actually very wrong. I started to get this bout of nausea that's sometimes very familiar with runners, but this was very amplified. And at about 15 miles, I started to vomit. And after that, I was completely unable to take in any food, any water. And that in itself is very dangerous because you have to adjust your caloric intake in a race that's at altitude because you're burning through things so much faster. You're getting dehydrated quicker. The temperature at the start of the race at 17,000 feet was about -4 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was a very cold day. and a lot of stress on your body. So it was really important to make sure that you were nutritionally prepared for that. And all of a sudden, I wasn't able to keep up with that schedule. About a mile later, I had to stop running. I started walking a little bit. And I remember looking up at Mount Everest, and it was a pretty special moment because the race runs away from Mount Everest. So you get to a point where all of a sudden you aren't able to see it anymore. And I had no idea when the next time I'd be back to the Himalaya was, and I wanted one last look at it. So I turned around and I looked up at it, and it's a pretty humbling feeling to look up at the highest point on our planet. And I was starting to get cold, and I could see these clouds moving across the summit cone. And I said, all right, I need to keep going. I need to keep my body moving. But when I turned away from Mount Everest, I realized that they weren't clouds crossing the summit cone. It was that I was starting to lose the vision in my eyes. What I subsequently found out was that because of this intense amount of stress on my body, my brain was starting to swell, and it was compressing my optic nerve, which caused these visual disturbances. So I kept trying to walk, kept trying to move forward, and trying to stay warm and stay lucid enough to complete the race. So I got to a point where you run basically 20 miles to this village called Namche Bazaar, and then you do a 10K loop, which is 3.1 miles out, 3.1 miles back. And I was just about to start on this loop because looking back, it was a very silly decision. It was not intelligent at all to continue running at this point because my vision was almost completely gone. I was hypoglycemic. I was starting to feel the initial stages of hypothermia. And when I started on this path, this 5K route out, the path started to sway in front of me and bushes started to move across because I was beginning to hallucinate. So at this point where my brain was really not starting to function properly, I realized that I needed to, at this point, the most important thing was that I had to go to the bathroom. So I reached over and I went to lean on a bush and I fell right onto my face because there wasn't a bush there. It was just in my head. And I was laying there on the ground for maybe 20, 25 minutes. And the point where it started to become scary was that I started to feel comfortable. I felt almost a warmness come over my body in these very cold temperatures at this high altitude. And I started to feel comfortable. And that's when the switch flipped in my head that this wasn't okay and that I could die here. I found it in me to push myself up, and I started stumbling, walking my way down this track. I made it out to the end point of the 5K out and back, and I started to walk back in. So I had 3 miles left in this race and was moving at a negligent speed at this point. I was barely moving forward. I was stumbling back and forth. And this group of Irish guys, including Tom Power, that I've become friends with over the past month of trekking in Nepal, saw me and very quickly realized the gravity of the situation. And because of them, and because of them sacrificing their race time to literally get under my arms and help me over the last 2 kilometers get across to this finish line, I was able to make it back to safety and was able to be okay. It was a very humbling experience for me at 23 years old, who I had been running all over the world for the past several years, felt very confident in my fitness and had this exact idea of what this triumphant moment of crossing the finish line was going to look like. For that moment to actually be looking incredibly weak under the arms of 3 very close friends. And that in itself was a great analogy to the journey for me, because what I realized is that my healing and my therapy through all of this wasn't just about the running. It was about all of these people that I had met along the way. And for a talk that I gave to a middle school in Florida in November, I had to try to make this more relatable to the students. And they said, middle school students aren't running marathons. How can we do this? And I totaled up the amount of time spent in the races. So 7 races, some marathons, some ultra marathons. And it was about a year of traveling that this was cumulatively. And out of 365 days, 44 hours of that were spent racing. So less than 2 days were spent actually running these races. What it really was being able to, at 20 years old, force myself back into the world after thinking it was this incredibly scary and horrible and terrifying place, to find all of these people and find the good in the world. We're constantly surrounded by negative news now more than ever. And it became so important for me to find this out for myself, because if you don't seek it out on your own, or if I wasn't seeking it out on my own, the news certainly wasn't going to show me how good it was and how many amazing people were out in the world and how many friends I could make that would help me run through and get through what I was struggling with. My last thought on all of this is that this COVID pandemic is upending our lives. And when I thought about the Boston Marathon bombing, it still is the worst day of my life. It is the worst thing that has ever happened to me. But someone asked me an interesting question recently where they said, you know, Bobby, if you could go back and you could take away that day, you could completely erase the Boston Marathon bombing from your history, would you do it? And in the first 2 years following the marathon bombing, I, of course, would have given anything to have that day be erased from my past. But when I thought about it, it took having this traumatic event, this horrible day happen to allow all of these incredible things to follow. If that day didn't happen, I would have never traveled. I would have never ran around the world. I would have never done any of it. I would have never have met some of the closest friends that I'll ever have. So my hope is that you can find the silver lining in COVID and that this is absolutely going to change your life. It's going to change the way society operates. But I hope that you can find it within yourself to take something out of it. And that's me. That's good. So we'll do Q&A, Kylie.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you so much, Bobby, for sharing everything. I do have a few questions for you. So I know you explained about your time in Everest doing the run. Do you think by far that was the hardest experience you had when you were running across the world?
Yeah, I think, I don't think it was, funny enough, I don't think it was the hardest race. I think without GI issues and sickness, I think it would have been relatively okay. I don't know, because of that though, if I'll run at altitude again. It's not entirely, at least altitude that high. I think once you get above 15,000 feet or so, it's you're kind of gambling with your body's ability. There's some other race. I did a race with actually a St. Anselm alumni as well, Joanna Marchek, who's class of 2014. The two of us ran a 50-mile race in Chile and Patagonia in early 2017. And that was probably the most beautiful race that I've done, but probably the most challenging as well. A lot of ascent, a lot of going over mountains for a long period of time.
Yeah, and especially for 50 miles, that must have been challenging. What was it like running on Antarctica?
Yeah, Antarctica was really neat. It was cool because it was the shortest of any of the trips that I'd done. It was about 2 weeks, and I had to take a week off classes. It was my senior year. And it was after winter break, and I had to explain to all my professors, who were very understanding, that I was going to be missing the week after winter break because I needed to be in Antarctica. You do this thing where you fly to Chile, and you basically wait for a weather window because you need to have optimum conditions for them to land a plane in Antarctica. So that includes the wind speed, the visibility, the ice pack, all things like that. But then once you're there, only on the continent for about 36 hours. That's all the permit would allow for. So just enough time we landed, made camp, went to bed. We're up at, I think 3 in the morning, because you're on a pole basically in their summer. So it doesn't get dark pretty much. So then you have this incredible experience of running around penguins for the first time, which at first is really interesting and it's exciting. And then after an hour or two, the penguins are so curious because they're not used to lots of human activity like this, that they're actually running towards you and they're getting in your way. So you're having to dodge penguins for the rest of the race after that. That
sounds ideal. I mean, running away from penguins, what a great experience.
Yeah.
I personally think. So I noticed, this is a personal question for me, I noticed in some of your pictures you had some PBR. I'm wondering if you brought a PBR to every continent that you went to.
I did. I was very lucky to have a sponsorship with PBR during these continents. It was the PBR thing started at St. A's. It was the cheapest beer at Market Basket my freshman year. So that was what was going on. And then PBR became such an important part of mine and my friend's friendship over the next few years. So at first it was, as a joke, I remember taking a PBR to Antarctica. and saying, taking a few photos, sending it back to the guys. And then they finally said, you have all these cool photos of PBR, you should send it to them, see if they'd want anything to do with it. So I sent like this long, heartfelt email to PAPS, just like their general email, saying how important PBR was to us, and that it was, the beer that we shotgunned in celebration and that we sipped during sad times, and it was the glue that held us together. It was like a really dramatic email, and they replied and saying, it was like, this is one of the coolest things we've ever heard. Like, what can we do to help? How can we support you? So for the next 2 years going on all these races, my obligation to them was basically continuing to take PBR to these continents and take pictures of it around Everest and doing all this stuff. And in turn, they gave me clothes and all the free beer that I wanted. So my friends were pretty excited about that.
All right. Did they kind of help you with payment for any of the races? How did you financially afford the trips?
It's funny. I was looking recently back at, because I wanted to find the original email that I had sent to Pabst as a, sorry, I just stopped the screen sharing there. Yeah, so I wanted to find the original email that I sent to them because I was telling someone about it recently. And I was looking back at it, I like very stupidly said in the email, I was like, I do not want any financial compensation. I'm looking for free beer and clothes. I'm like, oh, what an idiot. I'm like, why did I do that? No, I did this thing where for the duration of the continents, I was very lucky to be working as a paramedic. I was working at 3 different jobs. I was working per diem, so I could always find work, which was really nice. So when I was in America, I would work 60, 70 hours a week, and I would do that for however amount of time I needed until the next trip. So it would be like working for 3 or 4 months, traveling for 4 or 5 months, and then just doing this cycle until it was all over. And it was a matter of, taking night shifts. So I had a place to maybe sleep sometimes, and then going to because I was working in Manchester, so then going to the Y in Goffstown, doing a workout, getting my shower in, going back to work, crashing on people's couches, sleeping in my Toyota RAV4 between my skis and my bike, and just because I didn't want to lease, I didn't want to have to pay for rent if it just never made sense if I was only doing it for a few months. So very nomadic, even when I wasn't traveling for a bit.
Which is an experience in itself. So after your race on Mount Everest, did you have any long-term health issues that came up?
No, I was really lucky. The biggest concern was my vision. I did suffer a lot of from migraines generally, and the initial issue that I would have with the migraines is that I would lose vision. So I was worried about how that would impact me. So I did go to see my eye doctor maybe a month after I got back from Everest, and had a conversation, had him kind of look into my eyes to see if there was any permanent damage because of that compression of the optic nerve, and it was actually fine. So I was really, really lucky to not have any long-term effects from that. I guess the only long-term effect was that I'll probably never have rice pudding again. That was the last thing I ate at one of the aid station at mile 13, and that's what got vomited back up. So no inclination to eat rice pudding.
Yeah, I don't blame you for that. A lot of people are saying thank you. We have one other question. Thank you for sharing your amazing story and challenges you faced to overcome PTSD and mental illness. What's next for you? You're an inspiration to others. Where do you see your career and personal life long term? And then can you share some of your dreams?
Yeah. So start with kind of next adventure. My girlfriend and I were supposed to be on the Pacific Crest Trail right now. So we flew back from Scotland it was supposed to be at the start of April. With the EU flight ban and the UK flight ban, we pushed our flight up into the middle of March, and then very quickly realized that, because this whole time, I think everyone's expectations of what was realistic for things closing was literally changing by the day. And we were like, oh, we'll be hiking, we'll be in the middle of the woods, it's not going to have an impact. And then very much realized what an impact we would be having. So now we're in New Hampshire, so we're kind of just waiting to hopefully do a hike of some sort. We're looking at, it really just depends on when we can safely, for us and for others, get back out and travel and do something. So it would be, we're looking at the John Muir Trail or the Colorado Trail, really just something shorter. She has to be back for work in Scotland in August. So it just kind of depends on snowpack and timing, things like that. So that's kind of where out there. All my marathons for this year have been canceled. So I'm really interested to see where racing goes from here. I think it's gonna be a long time before I get large groups of people together. Sorry, what was one of the other questions?
Where do you see your career and personal life long term?
Yeah, so I had been applying to grad schools in Scotland, so I got into a few different programs over there to stay there with my girlfriend, and I'll stay in medicine. So when I came back to America, obviously shortage of healthcare workers, so I went back to work at my old job as a paramedic. So I've been working through this, and it's been nice to get back into medicine and continue on. So all the graduate school programs that are related to medicine likely at this point end up in a nurse practitioner program. So excited to continue with emergency and critical care medicine as far as career goes, unless my book really takes off, in which case I will just travel.
Yeah. We did have another question come in. Because of COVID, I had an amazing trip to Alaska canceled. My husband and I were going to celebrate our 40-year anniversary there. I feel guilty about being really sad about this because I'm alive and so many others have died. How did you let yourself feel the emotions you were really feeling about the Boston Marathon?
That's a really great question, because this is something that I wanted to convey through this talk. I think that when you are feeling these emotions about a trip being canceled, and then you suddenly look at the news and you see these statistics of the amount of deaths, and you see these people in these ERs and ICUs that are facing COVID every day. What you have to realize is that's their situation and that's their world, and it's not saying that you should be closed-minded and not look at others. And I think the biggest thing is to realize that you shouldn't feel like you're being selfish by feeling upset and angry that your trip got canceled, because that's horrible. I know what that feels like right now too. My trip got canceled, and initially, and you try to have this altruistic thing where you're like, oh, but you know what, it's okay because I'm not on the front lines, or I'm not doing this or that. But that's your reality, and that's horrible, and it's okay to have the emotion that comes with it, because I think one of the worst things you can do is suppress those emotions. I think suppressing negative emotion, I mean, it's cliche, but it just builds. And I mean, that was my life for 2 years. It was negative emotion building inside my head. And I think it's okay, and we need to, and we shouldn't even have to, but I feel like this need to be able to say to everyone that, like, it's okay to say that your situation sucks too, even if you're not dealing with COVID every day. It's still your reality, and you have every right to feel those emotions.
Yeah. Excuse me. Does PTSD reoccur in general or ever become an issue for you in your present day? And then are you completely healed, or do you manage on your own?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the big thing with mental health is that it's not a linear path, at least specifically with PTSD. It's not linear. It's a roller coaster. And even 7 years following the marathon bombing, I don't think that PTSD will ever go away, but I think that each year it gets better and you find ways to manage it. I look at just an example is I have less nightmares than I used to have. Like the year following the marathon bombing, it was constant, and it was almost every night, and it was horrible. But the big thing with mental health is a lot of times people feel that because they, a year or 2 years down the line, they're making all these strides, but then all of a sudden they go through this patch where they're depressed and anxious and have nightmares, that they haven't accomplished anything. But it does come in waves, and you can't devalue the progress that you've made because you're relapsing into a bit of depression. And it's that you do need to keep moving forward and finding healthy ways and outlets to get through it.
Thank you. This is a little bit of a different topic. Somebody's wondering if you're going to start wearing a Buccaneers Tom Brady jersey.
Man, I can only guess who that's from. I love Tom. That was one of the other things that I carried with me on all the continents along with Canada PBR is my Tom Brady jersey. I've been trying to reach out to Tom for years now, sending him pictures of his jersey all over the world. And I think there was a photo in the slideshow of his jersey on Kilimanjaro, and I brought it to the top at Katahdin when I finished the AT. But if a Tom Brady Buccaneers jersey ends up in my wardrobe, I don't know if I'm going to share that or not with the world.
I mean, he left. It happened. Thank you for sharing your story with all of us. The chat's going crazy with people just saying thank you, and you're an inspiration. So we really appreciate you coming on and talking with us. Before we let you go, somebody is wondering about your book. Can you let us know where we can find it, if it's available in print or just on Kindle, and how we can keep up with your story and your future journeys?
Yeah, absolutely. So really bad timing. I've had some good press. Like there's a New York Times article a week or two ago, and like all this stuff. And my book's sold out on Amazon right now, which isn't great. I talked to my publisher the other day, and Amazon did buy a couple hundred more copies. And then I'm communicating with Amazon, and it's kind of a mess. So I'm not sure when it will be back on Amazon. You can buy the Kindle version or the ebook on Amazon right now, so that is available. But if you want the print book, if you go on my website, it's www.runningwildbook.com. There's a link to buy the book on there, which is through the publisher, which is Mascot Books. And I don't know if you can type this into the chat or I type it in. I'll give everyone who's listening right now a coupon code for it. It's running, all capital letters, and the number 5. Running 5 will take $5 off of the book. So you can still get it through the publisher with that code.
And you shared your slide at the beginning with people can follow you on Instagram to see your future adventures.
Yes, at Running Wild Book, and then on Facebook at facebook.com/runwildbook.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your story and about your book. I know I told you earlier, I actually got one of the e-copies. I'm really excited to start it today. But thank you so much for sharing everything. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see you on the hilltop soon.
I know, me too. Be excited to get back.
Yes. Well, if we don't talk before, safe travels. Good luck on the Pacific Coast Trail. If you do go, you'll have to keep us posted.
I will. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone who listened.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Bye.